I used to think a lagoon was a gentle word. It sounded shallow, blue, decorated. A place for guests to lean over polished rails and say things like beautiful or prehistoric, while something with a neck older than flowers moved beneath them. Our lagoon was not gentle. It sat in the inner bowl of the South Island, where an old crater had been cut open, deepened, lined, sealed, reinforced, and then persuaded to pretend it had always been natural. From the higher service road, it looked almost peaceful, a round inland sea with pale cliffs, artificial reefs, and bands of mangrove-like planting chosen by people who wanted enclosure walls to reed as habitat. Visitors never saw it from there. The viewing galleries were lower, safer, curated. They saw blue water, foam, occasional dorsal movement, and the long improbable rise of a plesiosaur neck. I saw pumps. I saw intake housings disguised as rock shelves. I saw outflow gates masked with coral texture and maintenance scars under every painted striation. I saw the mesh screens rated for juvenile mosasaur bite force, though nothing in that lagoon was supposed to test them. I saw the white service buoys that marked hydrophone lines, the darker patches over deepened channels, the places where the crater wall had been bored through to let ocean water in after filtration, heating, sterilization, remineralization, and a dozen other verbs that made executives feel safer. No animal in that enclosure could reach the open ocean. That was the promise. Water could move. Sound could move. Chemistry could move. Nothing larger than a feed fish was supposed to go in or out unless a human signed 3 forms and stood in front of 6 cameras. I was one of the people who helped make that promise sound believable. My title was Senior Plesiosaur Bioacoustics and Behavior Scientist, which was too long for a badge and too narrow for what I actually did. I watched animals that should not have lived to have behaviors. I listened to them through hydrophones. I told operations when a feeding pattern looked wrong, when a breeding call was not a breeding call, when a surface avoidance response meant fear instead of stubbornness. I advised handlers who still wanted to call them by names even after we had written 6 internal documents explaining that names changed human risk tolerance faster than they changed animal cognition. I was not the first woman to do it. I was not the first scientist in my family, not the first to get a doctorate, not the first to publish something that made older men pronounce my surname carefully in conference halls. My grandmother had worked in comparative neurology. My mother had done field ecology in places where universities liked to send photographs but not funding. By the time I was standing over reconstructed marine reptiles in a private island crater, the family joke was that I had chosen the practical job. That morning, practical meant listening to an animal refuse water it had lived in for 7 years. I was already at the monitoring station above the West Service corridor when the overnight flag came through. 2 notes in the behavioral queue marked low confidence. In my experience, low classifier confidence meant the system had found something inconvenient and preferred not to say so. I pulled the overnight footage before I had coffee, which told me something about the notes even before I watched them. The oldest female in the lagoon, specimen P4 in the records and Mara, to everyone who ignored the records, had not crossed the West Trench since 320. That was not by itself alarming. Plesiosaurs were not clockwork. They had habits, not schedules. But she had crossed that trench every day for the previous 4 months, usually before dawn, usually after the feeder current system pushed the first shoals through the northern release gate. Instead, she held near the shallows with her body angled toward the service wall, head lifted just enough to breathe, 4 flippers making small correction strokes under the surface. When one of the younger males drifted toward the west trench, she struck him. Not a feeding strike, not courtship, not dominance in any pattern I recognized. She snapped once at his neck and then drove her own body between him and the deep water until he turned away. I watched the replay 3 times without speaking. "What do you think?" Laird asked. He was the morning enclosure lead, the kind of man who believed every problem was less frightening once it had a column in a spreadsheet. He had come in when I called him and crossed to the adjacent monitor without sitting down, arms folded, eyes on the screen instead of on me. "I think she's guarding against something," I said. "Against what?" "That's the part I don't like." On the monitors, the lagoon looked calm. The surface showed faint wind texture, the color gradient normal, oxygenation within range. Pressure sensors registered nothing outside maintenance tolerance. The west trench was just a darkened seam where the crater floor had been cut deeper to give the animals a cold retreat zone, a private abyss under an artificial paradise. Mara watched it as if something watched back. The first anomaly had come through the hydrophones just after midnight. At first it resembled a low-frequency contact call, deep enough to feel more than hear. Plesiosaurs produce sound mostly below what visitors expected. They were not whales. They did not sing, not in any romantic sense. Their calls were percussive, pulsed, sometimes modulated by body position and depth. A good analyst could tell stress from courtship, feeding anticipation from territorial pressure, curiosity from alarm. This was none of those. It arrived in intervals too regular for panic and too irregular for machinery. It had an animal contour but no animal source. The automated classifier rejected it, then accepted it as Mara, then rejected it again, then labelled it as pump cavitation, which was how the system apologized when reality became inconvenient. I put on the headphones in the control room and listened. The first pulse crawled through my jaw. The second seemed to come from the left speaker and the floor at the same time. The third made every plesiosaur on the west camera turn in the same direction. I took the headphones off. "Play that again," I said. Laird did. The sound was too low, too layered, like a call travelling through water that had forgotten how far it had travelled. Behind it was a pressure rasp, a grainy modulation that reminded me of an old tape played under a waterfall. The animals heard more than we did. That was obvious from the video. The humans in the control room looked bored or concerned according to job title. The plesiosaurs looked afraid. "Could be intake," Laird said. "It's not intake. You haven't checked intake." "I don't need to check intake to know pumps don't make animals form a defensive crescent." He looked back at the screen. 4 bodies had arranged themselves in the shallows now, all angled away from the west trench. Mara remained closest to the dark water, not because she wanted it, I realized, but because she was keeping the others back. That was when I felt the first real unease. It was not thalassophobia. I knew that word too well to misuse it. I was not afraid of deep water in the ordinary sense. I had spent half my adult life asking deep water to speak into cables. It was not bathyphobia either, not yet. The depth was mapped. The trench was measured. I knew its slope, its concrete reinforcement, its embedded sensors, its filtered circulation points. What unsettled me was that the animals were behaving as if the measured depth had stopped being relevant. A lagoon is an enclosure because its boundaries matter. That morning, every animal in the water seemed to know one of our boundaries had become decorative. Outside the monitoring station window, The lagoon surface held its usual color under a partly clouded sky. The readings had not changed, but Mara had not moved from her position at the shallow's edge, and I had stopped expecting her to. By noon, the anomaly had produced 3 arguments, 2 maintenance checks, and 1 sentence that should not have existed. The maintenance checks came first because R Epoch trusted instruments more when they confirmed boredom. Intake pressure normal, outflow normal, salinity normal, temperature gradient within predicted behavior for a partly clouded morning, turbidity elevated along the West Trench by 6%, then 4%, then 9%, but still inside a range that could be blamed on animals stirring sediment if one wanted to keep sleeping at night. The feed system ran at 9 o'clock. That should have changed everything. R Epoch did not raise every fish it fed to the large marine animals. Nobody put that in guest materials. The official language was supplemental live feed enrichment supported by local pelagic sourcing. The practical version was simpler. Attractant pellets, released outside the intake fence, drew small ocean fish toward a controlled capture channel. The system screened, quarantined, flushed, and eventually released approved shoals into the lagoon. It was cheaper than full internal aquaculture, easier to sell as naturalistic, and risky in exactly the ways all cost-saving naturalism is risky. The fish came in through the northern release gate in a silver cloud. Nothing took them. A juvenile male moved toward the shoal on reflex, then folded his neck back so fast his own wake struck him in the side. Mara did not pursue. The others stayed shallow. The fish dispersed into open water, glittering and alive and ignored. That had never happened before. At 10:40, the West Hydrophone line produced the sound again. This time, 2 cameras flickered when it passed through the system. Not failed. Flickered, like the image had been struck from underneath. At 11:15, operations requested a second acoustic review. At 11:22, I told them to stop calling it an acoustic review if they were going to ignore the acoustic scientist. At 11:30, they sent for Dario Mensch. Dario was not officially part of my team. He worked in signal cleanup and archival reconstruction, mostly for legal insurance and guest-facing investigations. If a microphone caught half a scream under generator noise, Dario could make it usable. If a hydrophone picked up a questionable impact before an animal injury, Dario could separate current, pump, contact, and bad luck with a patience that made everyone else in the room feel fraudulent. He arrived with a tablet under one arm and the expression of a man already prepared to be disappointed in the file. He did not say hello. He crossed to the acoustic console, plugged the tablet into the left port, and looked at me. "It's biological?" he asked. "I don't know what it is," I said. "That's not like you. I'm trying it out." He smiled without looking up and connected his tablet to the acoustic console. Laird stood behind us with crossed arms. 2 operations managers watched from the glass partition, pretending they were there for procedural support instead of liability containment. Dario listened once through speakers, then once through bone conduction pads clamped at the jaw, then once with the lowest band isolated and accelerated. The sound became insectile when he sped it up. Then it became mechanical. Then he widened the band, removed pump signatures, subtracted known plesiosaur vocal ranges, compensated for the west wall's echo profile, and played the remnant back at human speed. For 3 seconds there was only water. Then something inside the water tried to speak. No one moved. Dario stopped the playback. His hand stayed over the console. "That isn't a voice," Laird said. Dario did not look at him. I didn't say it was. You were about to. I was about to say it has voice-like structure. Voice-like structure from what? Dario looked at me then. Not at Laird. Not at the operations managers. At me, because I was supposed to have a vocabulary for impossible animal noise. I pulled the headphones on without answering. He played it again. The remnant was degraded almost beyond recognition. It did not sound like a person speaking into a microphone. It sounded like a person had spoken somewhere else, through some medium that did not preserve speech because speech was not one of the categories it respected. Consonants arrived as clicks of pressure. Vowels widened into low, mournful pulses. Some syllables seemed to exist only as gaps between frequencies. But it was not random. It had grammar in it. Not human grammar, maybe. Not intact. But enough to make my body recognize intention before my mind allowed it. Dario isolated a sequence, frowned, reversed nothing, normalized nothing, then played it 3 times. The first time I heard only a pulse. The second time I heard a phrase I could not keep. The third time I heard it clearly enough that I took the headphones off too quickly. Not where it is, where it faces. The room did not react because the room had not heard what I had heard. Dario had, or almost had. His mouth tightened. He leaned back from the console as if distance could make the file less present. "That's not possible," he said. Laird exhaled sharply. "So we're done?" Dario shook his head. No. I mean, it's not possible in a way that doesn't help us." The phrase did not sound like anyone I knew. Not exactly. But it had the strange familiarity of a voice from public footage, a person from a briefing video half-watched in a staff room, a man whose name had passed through internal alerts and rumor channels without ever attaching to my life. I could not place it. I did not want to place it. "Could this be crosstalk?" one of the operations managers asked through the open door. Dario laughed once. It was not a happy sound. From what? A submarine pastor. Interference. "This is a hydrophone array inside a filtered crater lagoon," he said. "Interference doesn't usually arrive with syntax." I replayed the original low-frequency recording while they argued. The animals were visible on the adjacent monitor. Mara had backed farther from the west trench. The juvenile male floated so still he looked sedated. The fish from the morning release had gathered near the southern wall, where they formed a tight, flashing mass, each tiny body trying to be in the middle of all the others. "Look at them," I said. No one did at first. "Look at them." They stopped talking. The West Trench camera showed nothing except dark water and suspended particulate. That was the problem. The lagoon was too engineered to let nothing remain unexplained for long. Nothing was a reading. Nothing was a result. Dario pulled up the directional data. The sound had not originated from any animal. It had not originated from a pump intake line, outflow gate, pressure regulator, or maintenance drone. The triangulation kept placing it below the trench, which was ridiculous because there was no below the trench that mattered. There was reinforced substrate, old crater rock, a service crawl space sealed before I was hired, and after that the geotechnical model became a thing we showed insurers. The array insisted the signal came from farther away than the lagoon was wide. Not louder. Not reflected. Farther. That was the first time I felt the shape of the fear accurately enough to name it. Thalassophobia was the old word, the popular word. Fear of deep water, vast water, the thing below the surface that may or may not be there. Bathyphobia was closer. Fear of depth itself, Not drowning, not sharks, not the sea, but the vertical fact of below. And then there was the ungainly compound I had seen in forums and joke glossaries and badly sourced articles, Megalohydrothalassophobia, fear of enormous things underwater. I had always disliked that word. It looked assembled by committee. It sounded like fear wearing a lab coat. But when the hydrophones told me something was speaking from a distance the lagoon could not contain, while animals bred for a prehistoric sea refused to enter their own deep water, I understood why people invented ugly words. Sometimes ordinary ones were too small. At 12:08, West Trench Camera 3 lost visual for 9 seconds. When it returned, there were 5 plesiosaurs visible in the lagoon. There should have been 6. We ran counts from every angle. Mara, juvenile male, 2 subadults, the younger female near the south wall, 5. Specimen P11, a 2-year-old male with a healed scar along his left flank, had been on camera at 12:07 and 41 seconds, drifting too close to the West Trench while the others remained back. At 12:07 and 48 seconds, the water under him dimpled. That was the only word I had at first. It did not splash. It did not whirlpool. It dimpled downward, as if the surface of the lagoon had briefly remembered another direction. At 12:07 and 49 seconds, P11 dropped out of frame. At 12:07 and 50 seconds, the surface returned. No blood, no breach alarm, no gate failure, no pressure surge large enough to move the official needle, no impact, no struggle. One animal gone. Laird whispered, "What took him?" I looked at the dark seam of the West Trench. Not where it is, where it faces. "I don't think anything took him," I said. My own voice sounded calm enough to belong to someone else. "I think he crossed something." The dive plan should have taken 40 minutes to approve. It took 6. That was not courage. It was institutional panic shaped into procedure. A missing animal inside a closed marine containment lagoon meant breach, theft, predation, catastrophic sensor failure, or a category no one wanted to name. Breach made no sense. Theft was absurd. Predation required another animal large enough to remove P11 without blood, pressure surge, or camera displacement, and every animal we knew about was still visible. Sensor failure was possible only if the animal had never existed, which would have been a relief to no one. So we chose inspection. The official objective was to evaluate West Trench structural integrity and recover diagnostic equipment from the hydrophone cluster. The unofficial objective was to get eyes on the place where the water had folded. I volunteered before anyone could pretend someone else should. Laird objected, then stopped when I asked him who in the room understood both the animals and the acoustic anomaly well enough to know what not to do. That was unfair. It was also effective. I suited up in the West Service Bay while the lagoon remained on partial lockdown. The room smelled of rubber seals and cold salt water. The staff watched me through glass with the fixed expressions people wear when they do not want to be seen watching a mistake happen. I did not look back at them. Looking back felt like agreeing. Full tank, redundant regulator, short-range comms, wrist slate, compact hydrophone wand, utility knife strapped to my left calf. Emergency flare I did not expect to use. Flashlight clipped high on my chest where I could reach it with either hand. I checked the flashlight twice and promised myself not to turn it on unless I had to. That was not superstition. Animals have thresholds. Light is attention. In a controlled enclosure, attention can become investigation. Investigation can become approach, and approach can become a mouth closing around whatever object made the world interesting. Plesiosaurs were not stupid. They were not monsters either. They were large, hungry, stressed animals with sensory priorities that did not care whether I had a doctorate. By the time I reached the descent platform, Mara and the others had moved as far from the West Trench as the lagoon geometry allowed. Their bodies floated in a loose arc near the eastern shallows, necks low, heads angled toward me. 4 pale shapes, very still against the blue water. They looked less like animals waiting to attack than animals watching another animal walk toward a fire. "Comms check," Laird said. His voice came thin and close through the earpiece. "Clear. Clear." Heart rate elevated. I noticed, "Helena." "Don't use my name like that." A pause. "Copy." The water closed over my head with the soft, total finality I had always loved before that day. The upper lagoon was warm, light-filled, tinted blue by design and biology. Suspended fish scattered ahead of me. The crater wall curved down in white-beige bands of artificial reef and seeded growth. For 20 meters, everything looked like work. Then the West Trench opened beneath me. Depth changes color before it changes anything else. The blue thickened. The reef texture thinned into surface plating and reinforced rock. The lagoon's cheerful engineering fell away, revealing the older practical geometry underneath: sensor mounts, cable guides, maintenance anchors, intake grills with mesh behind mesh behind mesh. Beyond them, the trench ran dark. No plesiosaur followed. That should have reassured me. It did the opposite. I descended along the guideline, one hand loose on the cable, the other around the hydrophone wand. My light remained off. The water ahead was not dark enough to require it, and I kept imagining Mara's eye turning toward a sudden beam. At 28 meters, the audio in my headset changed. Not louder, wider, wider. The normal lagoon bed was full of noise once you learned to hear it. Pumps, distant fish motion, structural ticks, the faint drag of moving bodies, the electric insectile chatter of equipment. This was different. It created a pocket in the soundscape. The closer I moved to the West Trench floor, the more every other noise seemed to bend around one region of water. "Control," I said. "I have acoustic lensing." "Repeat." "Sound is bending." Dario's voice came over the line behind Laird's. "Around what?" "That's the problem." I stopped 5 meters above the trench floor and hung on the guideline, letting the current settle around me. There was nothing there. Not nothing as in empty water. Nothing as in no object matching the effect. Particles drifted through the space ahead of me and changed speed without changing direction. Tiny bubbles from my regulator rose, crossed an invisible boundary and flattened for an instant into oval mirrors before returning to spheres. A loose strand of algae from the service wall drifted sideways, touched a region of water that did not look different, and snapped taut toward a direction that was not down. I swam left. The effect vanished. I swam right. The water shimmered. Not a portal. Not a window. Not a surface I could point to. From one angle, there was only the evidence: particles misbehaving, bubbles deforming, the hydrophone wand whining as if pressure had become frequency. From another angle, the empty water seemed to acquire thickness. A vertical distortion appeared and disappeared with my movement, like heat shimmer underwater, except heat shimmer does not make your depth gauge tremble. It has a face, I whispered. Say again, Laird said. I did not answer immediately. I circled it. That was the strangest part. You cannot circle nothing. You cannot inspect a direction. But my body understood the shape before my mind accepted it. From the east side, the region was almost invisible. I saw only what it did to the water passing through it. From the west, the distortion gained a boundary. Not an edge exactly. An orientation. The difference between looking at a pane of glass and looking along it, if the glass were made of pressure and animal fear. The phrase from the recording returned with such force I almost looked behind me. Not where it is, where it faces. Dario, I said, play the isolated phrase into my channel. Why? Just do it. The line hissed. Then the degraded voice entered my headset, thin and monstrous in the water. Not where it is, where it faces. The distortion pulsed. Every fish in the trench fled at once. Helena, what changed? Laird asked. The hydrophone wand in my hand spiked so hard the haptic warning buzzed against my glove. The water in front of me dimmed, not because the light changed, but because distance did. The visible particles beyond the distortion seemed suddenly far away, impossibly far, as if I were looking through a vertical slit into water deeper than the lagoon could hold. I backed away. For half a second that worked. Then the trench breathed in. There was no whirlpool. No dramatic spiral, no cinematic mouth opening in the floor. The water simply acquired an intention and I was inside it. My guidelines snapped tight. My shoulder wrenched. The comm filled with voices, my name, Dario swearing, Laird ordering someone to cut nothing and pull everything. I reached for the cable with both hands. My left glove slipped. My right caught. The pressure around my chest became a hand. I saw bubbles stream past me, not upward, not downward, but forward into the vertical distortion. My flashlight struck the housing of the hydrophone wand. The beam flicked on. For one clear instant, the face became visible. It was not a door. It was a wrongness in the water with a front and a back. The beam hit it from my side and flattened into a pale sheet. Particles inside the sheet stretched into yellow sparks. The sparks widened, brightened, and swallowed the blue out of the lagoon. My tether cut across my visor. Something huge moved in the dark behind me, far enough away that it should not have mattered. Mara, maybe, or another animal finally breaking its avoidance. A pale neck appeared at the edge of vision and vanished. The pressure took my legs. I tried to exhale slowly because panic wastes air, because training survives longer than understanding, because I was still stupidly convinced that if I did the correct things in the correct order, the world would remain obligated to answer in kind. The yellow light filled everything. Not sunlight. Not lamplight, not chemical glow. A violent yellow pressure behind my eyes, as if vision itself had been translated incorrectly. My last thought in the lagoon was not profound. It was that I had left the flashlight on. Then the water let go of my body and kept the rest of my life. I did not wake up on land. For a while, that was the only fact I trusted. There was water around me, but it was not the lagoon. The lagoon had weight, temperature, chemistry, equipment, the faint transmitted pulse of pumps and filters and living animals contained by human arrogance. This water had none of that. It held me without texture. It was neither warm nor cold at first, or my body had lost the ability to report temperature in any useful language. The yellow was still inside my eyes. I kicked. or thought I kicked. My fins struck nothing. My regulator was in my mouth. My tank was still on my back. My left shoulder hurt where the tether had tried to keep me in the world I came from. I reached for the line and found the severed end trailing from my harness, cleanly cut or not cut at all, simply ending in a frayed tassel of fibers that moved as if current passed through it in two directions. Training came back before memory. Check air. Check depth. Check orientation. Check light. My pressure gauge worked. My wrist computer did not. The display showed 31 meters, then 9, then 412, then a row of black squares. The compass rotated slowly without my moving my arm. The temperature reading settled on 19.4 degrees Celsius, climbed to 31, dropped to 2, and then blinked the manufacturer logo as if embarrassed. I turned off my chest light. Darkness did not follow. I blinked and waited. The water around me glowed faintly white from below and beside me, not enough to see distance, enough to make every suspended particle appear deliberate. I was in a vertical passage or chamber. That was my first interpretation. A flooded shaft, a service tube, a pale throat. The walls were white, slick, and close enough that I could have touched one with an outstretched fin if I trusted the scale. I did not. White epoxy was the closest comparison my mind offered. Not tile, not bone, not stone. Epoxy, resin, something poured and cured and polished until it became too smooth to be honest. In the Lagoon service areas, white resin sealed equipment bases and filtration housings. This looked like a world had remembered that material without remembering why humans used it. There were no seams, no bolts, no algae, no tool marks, nothing biological enough to comfort me, and nothing engineered enough to accuse anyone. I touched the wall with 2 fingers. It felt dry underwater. I pulled my hand back so hard I rolled sideways. Control, I said. The word stayed in my mask. I tried again. Control, this is Varga. Do you copy? My headset produced a soft, delayed click. Then my own breathing returned to me, stretched thinner and played underneath itself. No reply. I should have surfaced. That was the rule when orientation failed and communication died. Surface slowly, control ascent, regain reference. But I had no surface I could identify. Above me, the white shaft opened into more water and more pale distance. Below me, it narrowed into a luminous seam that seemed closer when I looked away. There was no bubble trail to follow. My exhalations rose for a meter, flattened, drifted sideways, then divided. Half went upward. Half went toward the left wall and disappeared into it without bursting. I watched that happen long enough for fear to become specific. Not drowning fear. Not yet. Category fear. The fear that came when your body kept obeying old rules and the environment answered in a different grammar. I pushed off the wall without touching it and moved upward, because upward was still the least insane choice. The shaft widened as I swam, or I shrank, or the space adjusted to maintain the exact distance at which I could not be sure. The white surfaces curved away. They did not become a room. They became an opening. My head broke the surface into silent air. I tore the regulator from my mouth and inhaled before I could decide whether the air was safe. It tasted like rain that had never fallen. The first thing I saw was not sky. Above me was blackness, but not night. It was too close, too empty and without stars. A ceiling would have comforted me. A cave roof, a tank lid, a service dome, anything that admitted structure. This was absence held overhead. I floated in a circular pool surrounded by white resin ledges. The ledges sloped upward in broad terraces, each slick and pale and shaped with the wrong simplicity. They were not stairs because the rises were inconsistent. They were not natural shelves because they repeated too cleanly. Water poured from one level to another in thin curtains without sound. I hauled myself onto the lowest ledge. The surface accepted my weight, then held it a half-second late. I lay there on my side, breathing through my mouth, tank pressing into my spine, one cheek against material that looked wet and felt almost dry. My suit began to steam in the air. That should not have happened. The air was not warm enough if warm still meant anything. The droplets on my sleeve lifted in little silver beads, rolled uphill, and gathered along the edge of the ledge where they slipped back into the pool one at a time. I laughed once. It was a bad sound. Too loud, too human. The white space opened in 3 directions. One passage sloped down toward a low vibration I felt in my ribs. Another narrowed into a smooth cleft lined with pale ridges like oversized gills. The third widened toward darkness and a smell that was almost salt. I sat up slowly and took stock. The yellow had finally cleared from my sight. For a moment I expected green. I do not know why. Maybe because some buried part of me had filed impossible interior spaces under a single visual language, the way people who have seen one emergency exit sign start imagining all exits red. But there was no green glow here. No luminous corridors. No dirt-brown floor with decorative mineral flecks. Nothing like the fragments I had heard in staff rumors about the missing analyst and his impossible evidence trail. This was white. White resin, white ledge, white waterline, white slopes reflecting a light without source. The place did not look sterile. That would have been easier. Sterile means cleaned. Cleaned means someone cared what grew there. This looked unfinished by anything human and complete by something else. I stood too fast and nearly fell. My fins skidded. I unclipped them with shaking fingers and left them beside the pool because walking badly was better than swimming blind. The floor gave slightly under my boots, then hardened. I took one step, another. The passage toward the salt smell widened as I approached it. Not physically, I told myself, then stopped. That was the first lie I consciously chose not to finish. The passage widened. The walls did not move in any way I could see. There was no shifting, no sliding, no organic flex. But the distance between them increased in response to my approach, or the meaning of distance changed, and either explanation was worse than the sentence I had refused to say. I raised the hydrophone wand. It had no reason to work in air. It clicked anyway. A low sound came from ahead. Not the mat voice. Not animal. Not machinery. Water against something too tall. I followed it because every other direction was a white approximation of a throat and because fear prefers a sound to silence. At the end of the passage, the floor ended. The world opened. I stopped so suddenly my tank struck the back of my head. Below me was water. Not a lagoon. Not ocean either. Though that was the word my brain threw into the abyss because it had nothing larger prepared. The white ledge dropped straight into a dark blue-green expanse that had no visible bottom, no slope, no shelf, no natural transition from land to depth. The edge beneath my boots was vertical, polished and sheer. Water struck it, rose, folded, and fell back in sheets that looked too heavy for gravity. Farther out, pale strips crossed the surface. Sandbars, I thought. Then, no. Then, maybe. Beyond them, blackness stretched where horizon should have been. I stood at the edge of a world that had taken the idea of an ocean and removed every part that made it survivable. My first scientific conclusion was embarrassingly small. This was not the lagoon. The first problem was that the water was too vertical. I know how that sounds. Water has no vertical. Water takes shape from what contains it. It fills, levels, spills, falls. It does not stand in blunt walls beyond an edge and wait there like architecture. This water did. The ledge where I stood formed one side of a white plateau no wider than a maintenance deck. Its outer face fell straight down into a blue-green depth that swallowed my sense of measurement within 3 meters. On Earth, even steep shorelines usually confess themselves at the edge. There is foam, rock, sediment, kelp, slope, the pale blur of shallower water, something. Here the white surface ended, and the deep began as if someone had cut the world with a blade. A wave approached from the darkness. I saw it too late, because it did not behave like a wave until it was already near me. It rose out of flat water without a curl, a smooth vertical swelling that gathered height instead of speed. For a moment it resembled a wall of glass being lifted from beneath the surface. Internal light moved through it in blue-green bands. Particles tumbled inside. Foam gathered along the top and then spilled over the face in white ropes. I stepped back. The wave struck the plateau. It did not break forward. It climbed. Water ran up the vertical face in a single translucent sheet, reached the ledge, folded over itself, and fell down again in a heavy curtain that sprayed my boots but did not wash me away. The force was enormous and strangely polite. It did not explode. It had too much mass for drama. I crouched and put one gloved hand against the ledge until my breathing slowed. Liquid architecture, I said aloud. The words helped. They were inadequate, but inadequacy with syllables can still delay panic. Another formation rose farther out. Not a wave this time, or not only a wave. A column of water stood up from the surface, blunt-sided, internally rippling, its skin travelling in many directions at once. It was perhaps 30 meters high, perhaps twice that. Distance lied here. The column streamed downward along its own sides, shedding spray into the airless black above it, then sank back without collapsing. No wind explained it. No tide explained it. No geological structure held it. It stood because this place permitted standing water. I forced myself to look away from the impossible verticals and examine what might kill me sooner. The pale strips crossing the surface were sandbars or near enough for a first hypothesis. They sat almost perfectly level with the water, long narrow ridges of wet beige material that formed paths, branches, loops and dead ends. Some were close enough to reach if I climbed down the plateau's side and waited between waves. Others curved away into misty darkness. They did not look broad. They did not look safe. They looked possible, which was the most dangerous category available. The water between them was black. Not black with mud. Black with depth. My chest tightened before I named the fear. That was always how it worked. Vocabulary arrived after the body had already made its report. Thalassophobia, the cultural shorthand. Fear of vast water. Fear of what the surface hides. Bathophobia, more precise here. The fear of depth as volume, of vertical space below your feet, of falling without air. And the ridiculous compound I had mocked in calmer rooms, Megalohydrothalassophobia. Fear of enormous things underwater. Nothing enormous had appeared. That was the problem with that fear. It did not require evidence. It required only enough water to conceal scale. I ran through what I still had. Tank, regulator, knife, knifo, hydrophone wand, flashlight still clipped to my chest, switched off. Fins abandoned in the arrival chamber. Tether gone. Comms dead. Wrist computer psyching through nonsense numbers and then nothing. I had perhaps 40 minutes of useful air if I stayed calm, and much less if I did what my body wanted. The question was whether air mattered here. I unclipped the regulator from my shoulder and held it near my mouth, then stopped. I was breathing the ambient air without pain. No dizziness yet. No burning lungs. That did not make it safe. But a tank was a finite resource, and the open black over the water did not promise any refill. I slung the regulator loose and began looking for a way down. The white plateau side had no ladder, no handholds, no erosion brakes. It was slick in the way of resin, a material that looked wet even where it shed water. But along one side, where the ledge narrowed into a sloping flange, small irregular ridges protruded just enough to grip with boot edges. They were not stairs. They were not designed. They were close enough. Close enough had become my entire civilization. I descended sideways, one hand pressed to the white surface, trying not to think about the drop below me. The next wave rose while I was halfway down. I felt it before I saw it, pressure in my ears, a soft pulling of the air, a tremor under my boots. I flattened myself against the slope. Water lifted beside me in a translucent wall. For 1 second I was looking into it rather than at it. Inside the wave were layers, suspended sand, tiny fish-like shapes, bubbles stretched into silver threads, and something larger far down that might have been shadow or might have been distance. The wall passed close enough that droplets clung to my visor. Its surface was cold through my glove. Then it folded over the ledge above me and rained down in sheets. I held. The ridge under my right boot softened, then hardened again. When the water withdrew, the first sandbar lay 3 meters below and perhaps 2 meters out from the plateau base. Between it and me was open water. No shelf. No intermediate slope. Just a vertical white wall ending in depth. I lowered myself as far as I could, hung from my fingers, and dropped. My boots hit wet sand. It depressed under me with a soft, sucking give. Not collapse. Not mud. Smush. The word came to me with such childish clarity I almost laughed. The sandbar accepted my weight, squeezed water around my soles, then held. I stayed crouched for 10 breaths. The bar was only a little wider than my shoulders. Its surface lay so perfectly even with the surrounding water that every small ripple crossed it in a transparent skin. Yet the ridge did not wash away. Grains shifted under my boots, but the structure held its shape, an impossible line of wet sand drawn across bottomless sea. I looked back. The white plateau towered behind me, sheer and silent, already less like an arrival point than a memory. Ahead, the sandbar branched into 3 paths. Left curved toward a cluster of low, pale shapes. Center ran straight into a field of rising spray. Right narrowed, turned, and disappeared behind a vertical water formation that stood like a moving wall. Ordinary navigation would have chosen higher ground. There was none. I looked at each root in turn. The center pulse came in cycles I could already feel in my ribs. Whatever moved there, it moved regularly enough to be timed, which meant it was too large and too dependable to predict. The left curve blocked my view of what waited beyond the pale shapes. The right route's current moved least strongly, the surface looked marginally wider, and the pressure to my left remained still. I chose right. I took one step. The bar held. Another. Held. Half. The water on both sides had no bottom. After 20 meters, my fear began turning into procedure. Place foot. Wait for settling. Shift weight. Check wave behavior. Do not look straight down unless necessary. Do not use flashlight unless necessary. Do not assume repeated shapes mean repeated safety. I told myself that last rule deliberately. Then I followed a path that looked exactly like the kind of path I had just survived. For a while it rewarded me. The first sand maze did not try to trick me. That was what made it dangerous later. It behaved for almost an hour like a system with rules. Bad rules. Terrifying rules. Rules no responsible universe would have approved. But rules. The bars stayed level with the sea. They were narrow, wet, and soft underfoot, each step pressing water up around my boots before the surface sealed again. When a wave passed, the ridge vanished under a transparent sheet and then reappeared unchanged. When current crossed from one side to another, the bar trembled but did not break. Branches led away, narrowed, widened, met again, then split in patterns just regular enough to feel intentional and just irregular enough to resist being mapped. Water whispered over some bars and slapped against others. The sounds were different enough that I began using them as signals. Whisper meant thin water crossing. Slap meant something was building behind me. I used the wrist slate until it died. At first I marked turns. Right from plateau. Left at double split. Straight past standing water column. Avoid route with lateral pull. The stylus scratched over the screen without saving anything after the third note, but the motion helped me think. Then I used memory. The maze had motifs. 3 short ridges before a long curve. A fork where the left branch sat a few centimeters lower than the right. Pale shell-like flecks embedded near intersections. I began to recognize combinations. I began, very cautiously, to improve. That was the correct word. Improve. I did not master anything. I learned which ripples meant a wave would overtop but not dislodge me. I learned to feel the difference between a bar that would hold and one that would roll under my foot. I learned not to step near edges where the sand looked darker and smoother because those places sagged. I learned that the deepest water was not always the darkest because sometimes the darkness was shadow from a vertical wave standing too close behind me. Correct observations. Correct adjustments. Wrong world. Still, the learning saved me. A broad pulse moved through the water from my left, and the sandbar under me dipped so suddenly I dropped to one knee. A sheet of water swept over my waist, cold enough to steal breath. I flattened, spread weight, and let it pass instead of trying to stand. 20 minutes earlier, I would have been swept sideways into the gap. This time, I stayed. When the water lowered, I was laughing again. Not happily, not sanely, maybe, but with the abrupt animal relief of a body discovering it had not died. Okay, I whispered. Okay, I can learn. The sentence steadied me. It also condemned me to trust the lesson. Beyond the first maze, The bars widened into a pale fan. The ocean around them remained bottomless, but the roots became less frantic. Some ridges ran almost straight for 30 or 40 meters. Others curved around pools of black water so smooth they looked glazed. The vertical waves rose farther away now, and the space between them seemed almost navigable. That was another word I should not have accepted. Navigable. I chose a route that bent toward a series of low white arches in the distance. They were not bridges. They had no supports that made engineering sense. They rose out of the water like loops of the same white resin material I had seen in the arrival passage, slick and pale, some broken at the top, some complete, all too tall to be useful and too deliberate to be natural. Beyond them, something darker rose and vanished in spray. Land, perhaps. A higher platform. A structure. I could not tell. The sandbars guided me toward it. Or I told myself they did. Twice I reached intersections that should not have existed. I would look back and see a path I had not taken connected to the route behind me, as if the maze had reinterpreted my movement after the fact. Once I found the same 3 shell flecks I had passed earlier, except they were arranged on the opposite side of the ridge. I knelt to examine them and discovered they were not shells. They were small hard ovals embedded in the sand, each with a spiral groove, each pulsing faintly when water crossed it. I did not touch them. The current began to change. At first it had moved mostly across the bars, inconvenient but readable. Now it ran along them, then against them, then seemed to rise from below through the sand itself. My boots sank deeper. The smushy give became almost muscular. I stopped, waited, shifted back. The bar held. I took another step. Held. A pattern, I thought. A living surface adjusting to wave stress. A granular mat. Some kind of colonial structure stabilizing sediment. Not sand in the geological sense, maybe. Something produced. Something maintained. The thought frightened me less than it should have because it was useful. It turned miracle into mechanism, and mechanism was a handle. I followed the handle. For another stretch, the maze narrowed again. The ridges ran close, sometimes only a meter apart, separated by black channels where water moved with a faint downward twist. I could step across some gaps. Others required sitting, lowering a leg, testing the opposite surface, shifting weight slowly. The tank on my back became a liability. The suit clung too warmly. My breath sounded loud in my own skull. The air was breathable but wet in a way that seemed to enter through skin. Sweat gathered under the suit and did not cool me. I unsealed the collar, then the wrists. The relief was immediate and wrong. The air touched my skin like water recognizing water. I told myself not to think that way. Then I thought it anyway. A wave rose behind me without warning. No sound came first. No pressure pulse. One moment the water to my right was flat. The next, a vertical face lifted out of it, full of suspended blue-green depth and falling foam. Its shadow passed over the sandbar. I dropped flat, wrapping one arm around a ridge that gave under my grip. The wave did not strike directly. It passed along the channel beside me, a moving wall taller than a building, shedding sheets of water from its sides. The sandbar bowed toward it. My body slid 6 inches. My left boot went over the edge. Nothing touched my foot. That was worse. No bottom, no slope, no weed, rock, sediment, animal debris. Just unsupported water below the ridge and my leg hanging into a depth that might as well have been space. I pulled myself back slowly. The wave sank. The bar rose. The world resumed, pretending it had not almost let me fall forever. After that, I stopped laughing. I moved for what felt like hours, though the word hour depended on instruments I no longer possessed and a sky that did not exist. The black overhead remained black, neither brightening nor darkening. The water world had light but not day. It had motion but not weather in any earthly sense. Mist appeared where spray should have fallen, drifted sideways, and dissolved into nothing. I began marking routes with pieces of my equipment. A broken slate clip at one fork, a strip torn from the outer pocket of my suit at another, the cap from the emergency flare near a low arch. Each time I told myself not to waste resources. Each time the need to leave proof behind outweighed the rule. At the fourth marker, I looked back and saw the strip of fabric 50 meters away, tied around a ridge I had not reached yet. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, it was still there. My first interpretation was that I had looped. My second was that the maze had. Neither helped. I sat down carefully on the sandbar, boots on either side of the ridge, black water inches from both heels, and forced myself to breathe. I had been thinking like an animal behaviorist and a diver. Read the environment. Learn the pattern. Conserve energy. Avoid panic. But the maze was not merely an environment. It was also, in some awful sense, a participant. Not conscious, maybe. Not predatory in the way an animal is predatory, but responsive enough that repetition could not be trusted as proof. Recognition does not guarantee safety. I said it aloud because it sounded like something I would write in a report. Recognition does not guarantee safety. The phrase became a rule. I stood. Ahead, the sandbars straightened. That was the first thing I noticed. No curves, no branching, no low smushy ridges bending around black channels, just a sequence of parallel pale bars running toward the white arches like lanes in a flooded road. They were wider than the maze ridges and cleaner. Their surfaces shone with a wet gloss that reflected the dim light in smooth bands. They looked safer. I did not step onto them. Not yet. I crouched at the edge of the natural bar and studied the first parallel ridge. It resembled wet sand. The color was right. The height was right. Water lapped over it in the same thin sheets. But the surface was too even, too smooth. The grains, if they were grains, did not shift independently. At the edges, the pale material became faintly translucent, with bluish threads running underneath like veins in a creature too large to have skin. I leaned closer. The ridge moved. Not much. Not enough to be sure. A slow contraction passed along it, almost below visibility. The glossy surface tightened, relaxed, and became sand again. I looked between the parallel bars. The channels there were narrower than the earlier gaps. Darker too. Inside them, hair-thin structures waved in the current. Cilia was the first word that came. Then tentacles. Then feeding filaments. They all moved downward. Not with the current. Downward. Anything that slipped between those bars would not float. It would be carried into the organism. I sat back on my heels. The trap was not meant for me. That was why it might let me pass. Most things in this world could not climb above the lure. They would swim between the ridges, brush the filaments, be moved down. I could stand on top. I could jump. I could exploit the fact that I was wrong for the trap. The thought was not comforting. It was a solution. I hated solutions here. They made me responsible for surviving them. The first false ridge waited 1/2 meter away, glossy and pale and almost exactly like safety. I checked the flashlight. Still off. Checked the knife. Still there. Checked my breathing. Too fast. Then I stood at the edge of the natural sandbar and prepared to step onto something, pretending to be the lesson I had just learned. The first step held. That was almost enough to kill me. If it had collapsed immediately, if the surface had burned through my boot or thrown tendrils around my ankle, I would have retreated. Obvious danger is generous that way. It gives the body permission to be primitive. The false ridge did none of that. It accepted my weight with a firmness the natural sandbars never had. No smush, no settling, no squeeze of water around the sole. Its glossy surface depressed perhaps 1 millimeter, then tightened under me like a muscle pretending to be ground. For 1 long second it felt safer than the maze. I kept my other foot on the natural bar and made myself count. 7 false ridges between me and the next natural sandbar. Perhaps 15 meters across. Perhaps 20. The gap on the far side looked identical to the one I was standing at, a narrow, pale line barely wider than my boots, with black channels on both sides and the organism filling the space between. 15 meters of something alive. I had studied organisms that use sandbar mimicry, feeding filament arrays, colonial trap structures. None of them existed on Earth in any form this complete. I noted this. I kept the note in the part of my mind that records and set the rest of my attention on my feet. The filaments between the parallel ridges moved below me in steady downward waves. They were not hairs exactly, not cilia exactly. Each was translucent, jointless, pale at the base, and dark at the tip. They did not grope upward. They did not need to. Anything that fell between the ridges would be touched by hundreds at once, then move down through the black water in a direction no current had chosen. I shifted more weight onto the false ridge. It held. A faint pressure passed under my boot, from toe to heel, then up into the bones of my shin. Not pain. Recognition. The thing knew something was on it. I froze. The ridge under my foot tightened again, then relaxed. Farther ahead, another parallel bar pulsed in answer. Then another. The movement travelled through the system, slow and low, not alarmed. A creature the size of a city street deciding whether a dust mote mattered. I was the dust mote. That saved me. I lifted my rear foot from the natural sandbar and stood fully on the false surface. The material was harder than sand, but not solid. It had a yielding shell over tension. Under the glossy top, bluish threads shifted in patterns that might have been circulation or nerves or neither. It looked alien in the way deep-sea animals look alien only until you remember they evolved on the same planet. This did not feel like that. This was not a jellyfish enlarged. It was an ecological solution from a grammar I did not share, using sandbar as lure, platform as mouth, mistake as digestion. The next ridge lay just under 1 meter away. I could step it if I trusted the first one. I did not. So I jumped. The movement was too hard. My tank shifted on my back. My boot landed near the edge of the next false bar, and the surface rolled slightly under me. For a moment my left leg slipped down toward the gap. The filaments below changed direction. Not all of them, just those beneath me. 1,000 pale threads leaned upward, then inward, and the black water between the ridges seemed to deepen around my falling boot. I threw myself forward. My knee hit the top of the ridge. Pain flashed white. My gloved hand slapped down on the glossy surface. It was warm. Not sun warm. Body warm. The ridge contracted. My palms stuck for half a second before peeling free with a wet, delicate sound. I crawled on hands and knees until I reached the center line, then crouched there shaking. The thing had reacted, but not strongly. That was the calculation I clung to. It could feel me. It could make local adjustments. It was not willing to spend large energy on me. Maybe I was too small. Maybe I did not trigger the right feeding sequence because I was above rather than between. Maybe the false sandbar system was designed for heavier animals, swimmers drawn into the channels by scent or current, or the promise of a clear path. Maybe it had not decided yet. I moved before that changed. The next jump was cleaner. The next after that less so. I learned the surface with my feet in the same horrible way I had learned the natural maze, except now every lesson was a negotiation with something alive. The ridges were not evenly spaced. Some were soft near the middle. Some had raised seams that looked like ripples in wet sand until my boot struck them and slid. Some were slick with a transparent film that tingled through the rubber of my soles. Halfway across, I looked back. Behind me, the maze I had spent hours crossing lay in its ordinary, impossible arrangement. Ahead, the false ridges continued in their clean, parallel lines. From the middle, the zone I had started from was already difficult to read. Safe and false had begun to share the same color, the same height, the same wet gloss. The trap's logic completed itself from the inside. By the time you are deep enough to understand what you are on, you cannot point clearly to where it began. A vertical wave rose beyond the false bars. I saw it through the filament's gaps before I heard it, which meant I heard nothing first. Only the shadow shift across the water that my brain translated as sound a half-second after the fact. It lifted slowly, a translucent wall of water full of tumbling light, too broad to avoid and too far to judge. The false ridges responded before the wave arrived. They tightened in sequence, all of them becoming lower, harder, more streamlined. The filaments between them accelerated downward. I had 3 ridges left. The wave would not wash the organism away. Of course it would not. The organism lived here. I was the loose object. I jumped, landed, jumped again. My right boot struck the second to last ridge and slid sideways. My ankle twisted. I dropped to one hand, and that hand came down in the gap. The filaments touched my glove. There was no bite, no sting at first. Only contact, soft as fine hair brushing skin through fabric. Then heat moved up my fingers. I gasped and yanked back. The glove did not want to come free, not stuck like glue, guided. The filaments had aligned around it, each tiny strand pulling with almost no force, but together creating a direction. Down, down. I ripped my hand out hard enough to tear the outer layer of the glove. A line of burning sensation crossed my knuckles. Under the tear, my skin was red and slick, not bleeding, not blistered yet, just aware in a way skin should never be aware. The wave shadow reached me. I made the last jump blind. For an instant I was suspended over black water between the false ridge system and a pale natural bar on the far side. Below me the filaments leaned. Ahead, the true sandbar waited, wet and smushy, and suddenly beloved. I landed on both knees. The natural sand accepted me with its soft, ordinary impossibility. The wave passed. Water covered everything. I held my breath as the false ridges vanished under a transparent sheet. The filaments below became silver lines. The organism's top surfaces flattened almost perfectly, indistinguishable from drowned sand. While the water held them under, they were still. No filament movement, no pulse, no contraction. Just a submerged plain. If I had arrived at that moment, if I had not seen them breathe, I would have walked straight onto them. The water lowered. The parallel bars shone behind me. A line of pale dots appeared along their edges, opening and closing. Not eyes, not vents, not mouths, I hoped. They were evenly spaced along the ridge lines, perhaps one every 30 centimeters, each pulsing twice and then sealing. The sequence ran from the nearest ridge outward, organism-wide, as if it were marking a record of what had just passed over it. I backed away on hands and knees until the natural bar curved out of sight. Only then did I look at my hand. The torn glove clung to my skin. I peeled it back with 2 fingers and held the bare knuckles up. The burn had spread in a branching pattern that followed neither vein nor nerve. The lines were pale red against my skin, fine as thread, running from the point of contact across my knuckles and partway up the back of my hand in dendritic branches. They looked almost like the bluish threads beneath the false ridge surface. My first thought was venom. My second was communication. My third was that I did not want a third thought. I flexed my fingers. They moved. The pain sharpened, then settled into heat. The tissue around the burn did not swell. It tightened. I stripped the damaged glove off with my teeth and spat it onto the sandbar. The air touched my bare hand. The heat eased. That frightened me more. I sat with that fact for a moment before I stood. The suit had already become too warm. My collar was open, wrists unsealed, sleeves damp inside. Now the exposed hand felt better in the impossible air than it had inside protective fabric. My body was beginning to prefer the place that should have been killing it. I tried to name what I felt, not the burn, not the fear, the other thing, and I could not find a word for it that would have passed review. I stood slowly. Ahead, the sandbar rose. Not much. Just enough to lift above the surrounding water by perhaps half a meter. A ridge, a natural one this time, curved toward a region of calmer surface where the vertical waves stood farther apart. Beyond that, through drifting spray, I saw movement. I caught it in peripheral vision first, a long pale shape sliding beneath the water to my right, parallel to the bar, moving with a lateral ease that no current explained. My first reaction was to look down, checking my footing, the body's instinct to secure the ground before raising the eyes. When I looked up, the shape had curved toward the surface. A long, pale shape slid beneath the water. For one exhausted, stupid second, I thought it was another false bar. Then the shape curved upward. A neck broke the surface. It rose and rose until the head emerged, narrow and dark-eyed, water streaming from a skull I knew well enough from living animals and fossil diagrams and sleepless nights of Grant language. Not exactly the lagoon animals. Older in proportion. Leaner. Nuwe. Wrong in details that mattered and did not matter. Plesiosaurus my mind supplied, then corrected itself. Plesiosaur-like, then gave up. It looked at me. I did not turn on the flashlight. I did not run. There was nowhere to run to. The animal floated 30 meters away, half submerged, its body a shadow under the surface, and its neck held in a trembling curve. By any human standard, it was enormous. By the standard of my morning, it should have been the most frightening thing in the world. It was afraid. I knew that before I knew anything else. Fear has posture. In humans, it narrows shoulders, lifts hands, tightens the mouth. In plesiosaurs, or in the animals close enough to them that my language had stopped caring about precision, fear moved through the neck first. The animal held itself too high and too still. A hunting posture would have been lower, more sinuous, head angled to reduce surface disturbance. Curiosity would have brought lateral motion, small adjustments, scenting or listening behaviors depending on the sensory anatomy. This was neither. The neck trembled against restraint. The body below the water made tiny correction strokes that kept it from drifting closer. It did not want to approach me. It also did not want to leave. I remained crouched on the natural sandbar with my burned hand tucked against my chest, the bare skin of my knuckles pressed against the open collar of my suit. The other hand rested near the knife on my calf. 30 meters of water separated us. In the lagoon, that would have meant danger, but understandable danger, an interval I had procedures for. Here, 30 meters was a rumor. The animal's eyes were larger than Mara's, set differently, with a reflective dark membrane that flashed when a vertical wave rose behind it. Its skin was pale along the throat and darker over the head, mottled in patterns that might have been countershading or scars. Water ran down its neck in thin streams. It opened its mouth once. No roar. No cinematic declaration of ancient hunger. A pulse moved through the water under my feet. I felt it in the sandbar before I heard it. A low, complex vibration, almost below sound, carrying through the ridge and into the bones of my legs. Not a call meant for air. Not for me. The hydrophones in the lagoon would have caught only the crudest edge of something like that and labelled it noise. My wand was clipped to my hip. I touched it without thinking, not to record, just to feel the shape of a tool I understood. The animal called again. The water beyond it answered. Every part of me that still belonged to the lagoon wanted to make a note. Call and response. Stress vocalization, directional warning, social contact, frequency below human hearing, possible environmental cue. Then the animal looked directly at me and the scientific categories thinned. Recognition passed between us. Not personal recognition. It did not know Helena Varga. It did not know badges, published papers, feeding schedules, or the shape of a human face seen through acrylic viewing glass. But something in its body knew a category that included me. Small upright thing. Air breather. Near food. Near danger. Near the strange place where meals arrived. Near the place where wrongness opened. Prey adjacent. Food associated. Not food. Not yet. Its nostrils flared. Its head dipped. For one absurd second, I remembered Mara taking fish from the north release current, the way her eyes tracked the silver cloud before her neck moved. This animal's gaze held a similar association, but broken, displaced, buried under panic. It saw something that belonged to a feeding world inside a world where feeding no longer meant safety. "I'm not doing it," I whispered. The animal blinked. The water behind it lifted. At first, I thought it was another vertical wave. That was reasonable. I had seen water stand where it should fall. I had watched columns rise and sink without wind. My mind chose the familiar impossibility. Then the plesiosaur-like animal folded in on itself. Not physically, behaviorally. Its neck shortened, head snapping down toward its body. Its flippers struck the water once, hard enough to throw spray. The sound it made was not the low call from the fore. This was a burst, high and jagged, a noise I felt in my teeth. It was not warning me. It was terror escaping before movement could. The surface behind it bulged. No splash. No dorsal fin. No teeth rising in a clean arc. The ocean simply became higher over an area too wide for my mind to outline. A smooth back or ridge or pressure field pressed upward from below, lifting water into a long dark swell. Foam slid off its sides. The plesiosaur-like animal tried to turn. For a moment scale inverted. The animal I had been afraid of became small. Not small like a fish. Small like an object on a table when the table is a continent. Something pale appeared beneath the surface. Not a head. Not a mouth I could understand. A curve. A moving boundary. The water over it thinned to a translucent skin, revealing texture underneath. Ridges, scars, maybe plates, maybe folds in flesh so large each crease had its own currents. The thing did not strike in the way predators strike. It displaced. The plesiosaur vanished. That was all. One instant it was there, neck arched, body twisting, flippers clawing at water. The next, the swell rolled over it, and the animal was simply gone into white turbulence and a sudden red-brown thread that unwound, vanished, and left me ashamed for noticing colour. I did not scream. My body had selected silence as the only remaining defence. The swell continued past. It moved slowly, which made no sense until I understood that speed did not matter at that scale. A thing that large did not need to lunge. It did not need to hurry. Its motion was geography-changing jurisdiction. Water climbed around it and over it in broad sheets. Waves formed, not from violence, but from the fact that something had occupied a volume the sea had believed was its own. The sandbar under me rose. I dropped flat and pressed both hands to the wet surface, burned fingers screaming against the cool sand. The bar lifted perhaps half a metre, then settled. Water withdrew from one side and poured across from the other. The current reversed twice. Foam gathered in long strings that stretched toward the passing mass and then snapped back. I saw an eye. Only for a second. Not the eye that would come later. Not the impossible black pupil that would end measurement for me. This was smaller, if that word could apply to anything embedded in a body whose visible portion had turned a marine reptile into debris. A dark oval opened below the surface, caught light from nowhere, and slid past without fixing on me. I was not prey. I was not even information. Not yet. The thing moved beyond the sandbar field. Its back, or flank, or whatever surface I had been permitted to see, sank under a spreading plain of disturbed water. A wave rose after it, late and massive, but not explosive. It travelled outward like a decision made by a faraway landmass. When it reached me, I had time to brace. That was the worst part. Tsunamis in films arrive as walls of punishment. This was not punishment. This was consequence. The water rose under my body, lifted the sandbar, folded over my legs, and passed on. I slid, caught the ridge with my elbow and stayed. The wave did not care. It had not come for me. Afterward, the ocean went nearly still. Where the plesiosaur-like animal had been, foam turned in a slow spiral. No body surfaced. No remaining flipper, no head, nothing for my mind to mourn properly. I remained on the sandbar, cheek against wet sand, breathing in short, shallow pulls. By human standards, the animal had been enormous. By lagoon standards, a major containment risk. By guest standards, miracle and nightmare in one prehistoric body. Here it had been the size of a question answered too quickly. I thought of Mara guarding the shallows, the juvenile vanishing, the hydrophones reporting impossible distance, the animals hearing an ocean inside a lagoon. They had not been afraid of a sound. They had been afraid of context. The plesiosaur had recognized me, or something like me, because in whatever broken way this place connected to ours, humans were associated with food, gates, openings, wrong arrivals. But its fear had belonged to a much older lesson. In this water, large animals fled. In this water, large animals disappeared. I pushed myself up on one elbow. My burned hand shook. My suit clung like a fever. The air against my exposed wrist felt better than the fabric covering it. I wanted to remove the tank, the suit, everything that marked me as a diver from a world with procedures, but the practical part of me refused. Tools mattered until they did not. The flashlight remained clipped to my chest. Still off. I touched it once to confirm it was there. Beyond the foam spiral, something moved under the water at the edge of visibility. Not the vast thing. Something smaller, faster. The right size for me. A long shadow crossed beneath a nearby sandbar, turned and disappeared behind the standing wall of a vertical wave. I waited for it to reappear. It did not. The silence after the plesiosaur's death felt staged, like the world had cleared room for the next thought. I stood because staying low made me feel like food. The sandbar ahead curved toward higher shapes now. The white arches were clearer, enormous slick structures rising from the water, some natural only in the way a shell is natural, some architectural only in the way bones are architectural. Far beyond them something towered through spray, a vertical form with a narrowed body and a swelling top. A lighthouse, my mind said, then corrected itself with exhaustion. Not a lighthouse, but it was high, higher than the waves, the first place I had seen that belonged to above. I began moving toward it because the alternative was waiting for the shadow to decide what I was. The shadow followed me for 3 sandbars before I admitted it was following. At first I treated it as environmental motion. That was safer than treating it as intent. The water had already shown me too many ways to move without purpose. Walls rising, ridges tightening, foam pulling sideways, currents reversing because some impossible mass had passed beneath a place I had mistaken for surface. A shadow in water did not have to be an animal. Then it corrected for me. I stopped at a fork where 2 narrow bars split around a black channel. The left route curved toward one of the white arches. The right ran straighter but lower, vanishing under thin sheets of water each time the sea breathed. I chose left. The shadow beneath the channels slowed. I stepped right instead. It slowed again. Not current. I stood very still and made myself look properly. The shadow was perhaps 6 meters long, perhaps 8, moving just deep enough that I could not separate body from distortion. It did not have the plesiosaur's long neck. It moved compactly, with quick lateral corrections and bursts of stillness that belonged to ambush animals. Something like a crocodilian shape crossed with something faster, more pelagic. Or none of that. Classification kept reaching for Earth and returning with broken tools. I had avoided the flashlight because light is attention. Now attention had already found me. I crouched slowly and touched the sandbar with my bare burned hand. The heat in my fingers had settled into a constant line of awareness, not pain exactly, more like a second pulse running alongside my own. The sand was cool against my palm. Real sand, or the version of real I was willing to accept. It smushed and sealed around my fingertips. The shadow drifted closer. I thought of Mara and the young males in the lagoon. I thought of approach angles, startle distances, feeding thresholds. Predators do not decide once. They accumulate permission. Distance closes, prey fails to respond, opportunity clarifies, and the body chooses before cognition has finished justifying the strike. I had to interrupt that accumulation. I unclipped the flashlight but kept it off. The object felt absurdly small in my hand, a cylinder of human certainty. Battery, bulb, switch, rubber seal. Designed for darkness, not for a universe that had misplaced its sky. I backed along the left bar, keeping my body angled toward the shadow without facing it fully. Direct confrontation sometimes deterred animals. Sometimes it invited them. Sideways retreat sometimes reduced predatory trigger. Sometimes it made you look injured. Everything I knew came with a species note, a context note, an asterisk. This animal did not come with literature. The shadow slicked under the fork and vanished beneath the bar ahead of me. I stopped. The water to my right bulged. I threw myself backward as a head broke the surface where my leg had been. The mouth was not large by the standards of the thing that had erased the plesiosaur. That was the first insane comparison my mind made. Not large, only large enough. The jaws opened in a black crescent lined with translucent teeth that seemed too numerous for the skull. Water sheeted off a blunt ridged snout. One eye, pale and lateral, rolled toward me. I hit the sandbar on my back. The animal's jaws snapped shut on empty air. The force of it slapped water across my chest. I did not turn on the flashlight. Not yet. I rolled, got one knee under me, and moved before the animal could correct. The bar ahead narrowed. Of course it did. The left route I had chosen curved into a thin, pale line with black water tight on both sides. There was no higher ground, no wall to climb, no cover. The white arch rose 50 meters ahead, slick and distant, connected to nothing I could reach quickly. The animal submerged. My suit was suffocating me. The thought arrived separate from the chase, abrupt and bodily. Heat trapped under the neoprene. Sweat with nowhere to go. Skin prickling along my spine, under my arms, around my neck. The water-whirled air touched the parts of me I had exposed, and those parts felt clearer, calmer, more accurate. The covered parts felt wrong. The sensation was not new. I had noticed it during the maze, during the crossing, but under the urgency of pursuit it arrived as a demand rather than a nuisance. I stumbled, caught myself, and kept moving. The shadow reappeared on my left. It was herding me. That changed the shape of the encounter. It did not need to outrun me on the bar. It only needed to push me into choosing a bad step. The animal had understood the environment faster than I had. All the environment belonged to it in a way it could read without understanding. I reached for the knife. Ridiculous. Necessary. Necessary. Both I paused. The handle slid into my palm. My burned fingers protested as they closed around it. The blade was meant for tangled line, harness cuts, emergency release, not stabbing prehistoric water-world predators in a dimension where the ocean sometimes stood upright. I kept it anyway. Tools mattered until they did not. The next vertical wave rose ahead, blocking the view of the arch. It formed slowly, a blue-green wall full of internal falling light. The bar disappeared beneath a transparent skin as water spread over it. Behind me, the animal surfaced again. This time it did not strike. It placed its head above the water and followed, the eye fixed on me. There was nothing mystical in it, no malice, no ancient wisdom. Hunger and calculation were enough. I was the correct size. I moved badly. I was isolated on a route with no escape. I turned the flashlight on. The beam cut across the standing wave first, flattening into a pale ribbon inside the water wall. Then I swung it into the animal's face. The reaction was immediate, but not the one I wanted. It flinched, yes. The eye membrane flashed. The head jerked sideways. For half a second, the animal dropped lower, and I had room to move. Then the beam made me interesting. The mouth opened. I ran. There was no dignity in it, no controlled retreat, no scientist balancing fear against observation. I ran along a strip of wet sand, no wider than my body, while black water slapped both sides, and an animal built to move through that blackness came behind me. The tank slammed my back. The open collar of my suit flapped against my throat. My bare hand burned around the knife. The flashlight beam bounced uselessly across water, sand, white arch, water, teeth. The bar ended. Not narrowed. Ended. A gap of perhaps 2 meters separated it from the next ridge. I could jump that. In training, rested on dry land without a tank and a predator and a universe arguing with gravity, I could jump that easily. The animal surged. I jumped. My front foot hit the next bar. My rear foot did not. The edge collapsed under my heels, smushy sand sliding away into black water. Something brushed my boot. Not filaments. Not the false ridge. A hard scrape, then pressure. The animal had my fin strap. I kicked without thinking. The strap tore loose. The boot came with it halfway. I hit the bar on my side, rolled and lost the knife. It slid down the wet surface, caught on a ripple of sand, then disappeared over the edge into the black water below. The animal lunged after me. There was nowhere left to go. I saw the mouth rise, saw the inner tissue pale and ridged, saw water pouring between teeth, saw the flashlight beam reflect off the eye and return to me in a white dot so small it might have been a star. Then the predator stopped. It did not hesitate. It reversed. Every part of it changed direction at once, as if an invisible hook had jerked through its spine. The head vanished. The body thrashed sideways, struck the sandbar hard enough to shake it under me, and disappeared into depth. The wake nearly threw me off. I lay flat, unable to move. The water around the bar went smooth. The flashlight remained on, clenched in my hand, its beam pointing at the place where the animal had been. Suspended particles drifted through the light. One by one they began to rise. Not upward, toward something. The pressure changed. I felt it in my teeth, first, then in the burned lines across my hand, then in the old bruised place where the tether had wrenched my shoulder during the pull-through. The entire water field seemed to inhale, but not like the transfer face. This was broader, slower, too large to have a center I could locate. The predator had not fled me. It had fled weather. No. Terrain. No. A body so large that weather and terrain were the closest words my frightened human mind could reach. The water to my right began to lift. I turned off the flashlight. Darkness did not return. Something below the surface was bringing its own absence of light with it. It did not arrive. Arrival implies distance travelled, an object entering a scene, a before and after small enough for the mind to arrange. This was not that. The world reweighted itself around a fact that had already been there. The water rose, not in a wall, not in a wave. The whole field to my right lifted in a slow continental swell, so broad that my body understood motion before my eyes could find shape. The surface became a hillside. Foam slid down it in long white veins. The black water between sandbars drained sideways, then returned, then rose again, confused by a displacement too large for its own rules. I pressed myself flat to the bar. The flashlight was off. My mouth was open. I do not remember choosing that. My ears ached. My tank scraped against wet sand each time the ridge tilted. The burn on my hand throbbed in a pattern that matched the pressure passing through the water, a deep rhythmic pulse, as if the water itself had borrowed a heartbeat from whatever moved beneath it. Something pale moved under the surface. At first I thought it was the seafloor. That is the truth. My mind, desperate for structure, gave the pale immensity the category of bottom. A shoal, a shelf, a submerged plane rising under me. Then the surface over it flexed, and the pale thing beneath continued moving in a direction no seafloor has ever moved. The predator that had chased me was gone. I hoped it had escaped. That hope surprised me. I had wanted it gone because it wanted to eat me. Now, in the presence of something large enough to make predation seem intimate, the animal became almost familiar. It had been dangerous within a scale I could inhabit. Teeth, eye, pursuit, jump, mistake. A story with verbs. This had no verbs yet, only scale. The pale submerged surface stretched beyond the standing water walls, beyond the white arches, beyond my ability to decide where one edge might be. Its texture resolved in pieces, ridged bands, darker scars, fields of tiny pits that could each have held a boat, slow contractions passing under skin or shell or something that had not chosen between them. Then the eye opened. I did not recognize it as an eye at first. I saw a black curve under the water, a line I thought was a geological feature, a seam in the pale surface, some fold in tissue too large to read as tissue. Then a widening oval. Then a boundary between darknesses, one sort of black giving way to another, and the difference between them becoming visible as the water above it thinned until it became a lens. A ring of muted colour appeared around the black centre, not iris in any simple sense, but patterned tissue, bands of green, black and bronze and pale blue, each band so wide my mind tried to turn it into terrain. The pupil alone was larger than the lagoon's west trench camera bay. No Ponce Doston Maid. Larger than the bay and the service platform together. No. I stopped correcting because every correction made the measurement worse. I raised my head without meaning to. The eye was below and beside me, angled enough that I could see only part of it through the water. If I had been directly above the pupil, I think my mind would have treated it as a whole. From the side, it was a wall. A living black wall set inside an iris that curved away into water too deep to hold its colour. It looked at me. Not focus, perhaps. Not the way a human focuses. Not even the way a plesiosaur did, but a change passed through the structure of the eye. The pupil narrowed by a degree so small that it moved like geography. The colored tissue around it rippled once. I became information. That was different from becoming prey. The difference saved my life. I tried to measure it because I was still myself. A plesiosaur in the lagoon, stretched nose to tail, would have fit across maybe a fraction of that pupil. One of the largest reconstructions we modelled for guest education would have been a fleck against the iris. A megalodon, if dropped whole into that black centre, became a unit too small to comfort me. 5 megalodons? 10? The numbers slid. A blue whale? The largest animal my original world had produced, the standard answer in every classroom, the fact children recited with delight. How many blue whales across the pupil? Across the iris? Along the visible curve of the head I could not see? Numbers appeared and died. 200 meters, 500, 1,000. Meaningless. The visible eye forced geometry on me because it had edges. The unseen body destroyed geometry because it had none I could contain. If the eye was that large, how wide was the skull? If the skull was that wide, how long the body? If the body was miles long or miles wide, and the word miles entered my mind with a humiliating smallness, then what depth did such an animal require? Earth's whales dive in oceans measured in kilometers. The deepest trench on Earth could swallow mountains and still be a surface scratch against planetary scale. If one took the ratio badly, crudely, desperately, if one scaled habitat depth with body volume in a place where neither physics nor biology had agreed to remain familiar, 750,000 miles. The number arrived and I rejected it. 1 million miles. I rejected that too. Then I looked into the pupil and understood that rejection was not evidence. My burned hand rested against the sandbar beside my face. The heat in the lines had quieted, not because it was gone, but because the rest of my body had become too occupied to register it. Through the wet sand, through the ridge beneath me, I felt the creature's slow passage as a ground truth pressure, the kind that does not come through water, but through the substance of whatever this world used instead of stone. The water over the eye did not behave like water over an animal. It behaved like atmosphere over landscape. Pressure moved through it in slow bands. Particles descended, rose and then hung motionless in layers, as if density changed from one invisible shelf to another. What would water be at a depth like that? Not water, not as I knew it. Exotic fluid, compressed medium. A state of matter with the memory of ocean but not the obligations. What would a world like this have for a core? Rock? Metal? Heat? Heat? Or no core at all, only depth folded through some other geometry, a universe in the act of deciding whether it wanted planets? The thought should have terrified me. It did. But beneath the terror was something else too deep to call calm. Fascination. The eye remained. The creature did not strike. It did not call. It did not try to understand me in any human sense. But in that pause, I felt the distance between our minds as a form of contact. Not communication. Not mercy. Mutual noticing. I was the rare thing. All my life, even in the impossible practical job, I had been one more person after a first. One more scientist in a lineage of scientists. One more woman in a discipline where others had opened the door before me. One more expert telling wealthy people that their miracle animals were still animals. Here, lying on a wet strip of impossible sand, looking into an eye large enough to make arithmetic feel childish, I understood that I might be the first human being ever seen by that creature. Not the first to discover a species, not the first to map a trench, the first to be noticed across that distance. The cost of the thought was immediate. Home receded from me, not as a place far away, but as a category that no longer applied. A person cannot travel home from a direction that does not exist. A radio cannot call across a distance that has stopped being distance. A scientist cannot publish from inside a universe that may not yet be finished becoming one. The pupil widened. A slow pressure wave moved outward. The sandbar lifted under me, not violently, almost gently. My burned hand touched the wet surface and, for the first time, did not hurt. The creature began to move. Again, move is too small. The water rose over its passage in a long surge. Not tsunami, not attack. More like a continent turning in sleep beneath a sea that had learned to accommodate impossible bodies. The swell passed under me and continued toward the white arches. Standing waves bowed away from it. The dark channels between sandbars filled, emptied, filled again. The eye slid beneath deeper water. For a moment, the pupil remained visible as a black disk under blue-green depth. Then it was gone. The absence it left was larger than its presence. I stayed where I was until the last surge settled. The predator did not return. I did not blame it. When I finally stood, my legs trembled, but not only from fear. My body had changed its question. It was no longer asking how to get back to the lagoon. It was asking how to continue in the place where I was. That should have horrified me more than it did. Ahead, the knot lighthouse rose through spray, high on its slick arch, above the reach of the standing waves. I began walking toward it with my flashlight off, and my eyes full of the dark shape of another mind. The arch was farther away than it had any right to be. It looked close after the eye. Everything did. My sense of distance had been damaged so badly that any object with a visible base and top seemed almost domestic. The knot lighthouse stood above the water on a pale, slick span that rose from one island-like mass, curved over a black channel, and joined a higher platform beyond. From the sand maze it had appeared reachable. From the first white arch it receded. From the second, it seemed to rotate slightly, revealing that the structure I had mistaken for a tower was not set on the arch, but grown through it. I use grown because built would be worse. Built would imply builders. The arch's surface resembled the white epoxy ledges near the arrival pool, but older, if that word meant anything here. It was not smooth everywhere. Fine ridges ran along it in sweeping parallel lines, like growth rings stretched into architecture. Where sprays struck, the surface shone. Where it dried, it became matte and chalk pale. Shell was the closest natural analogy. Bridge was the closest human one. Neither was enough. The climb began at a place that looked almost generous. Rungs protruded from the side of the arch in an uneven vertical line. I saw them from a distance and felt a human relief so sudden it embarrassed me. A ladder. Access. Intention arranged around bodies like mine. Then I reached them. They were not metal. They were not fixed into holes. Each rung was a curved protrusion of the same pale material, flattened on top, slick underneath, spaced with a logic that mimicked climbability without quite understanding fatigue, reach, or fear. Some were too close, some too far, some angled outward. A few forked subtly at the ends, as if they had grown toward different users and never decided which to serve. False access. I stood below them with one hand on the arch and laughed silently. Of course, the place did not make lies from nothing. It made almost useful things. Almost ground. Almost sand. Almost shelter. Almost ladder. It produced structures that recognition could enter and not safely leave. The first rung held. The second held. At the fifth, my boot slipped. My whole body dropped, and I should have fallen backward into the channel below. Instead, my bare burned hand slapped against the arch surface and stuck. For 1 second I hung by skin. Not entirely. Not glue. Not suction. Something subtler. The pads of my fingers, the heel of my palm, the tender branching burn from the false sandbar, each made partial contact and held at slightly different strengths. My gloved hand slid. My bare hand gripped. My left boot skidded sideways. My right knee struck a lower rung. The result was not safety. It was a 3-part argument over where my body belonged. I pulled myself back onto the rung, gasping. My hand released when I asked it to. That was almost worse. I looked at my palm. The burn lines had darkened from red to a muted blue-grey. Tiny ridges crossed them now, not raised enough to be scales, not flat enough to be scars. The skin looked like it had been rewritten by an editor with different priorities. No, I said. The arch did not answer. I kept climbing because the water below had begun to rise again, and because the thought of not climbing was larger than my horror at the hand. Halfway up, I stripped off the upper half of the wetsuit. There was no elegance in the act. I wedged one arm through a rung, unclipped what I could, tore what I could not, and peeled neoprene down to my waist, while spray struck my back. The relief was immediate and disproportionate. Air touched my shoulders and the back of my neck like recognition. My skin prickled, then steadied, then stopped, expecting cold. I should have been cold. I was not. Tank, suit, tools, human preparation, everything that had made me competent in the lagoon had become weight here. I kept the tank because dropping it might pull me with it. I kept the flashlight. I kept the torn utility sheath though the knife was gone. I kept the hydrophone wand because a scientist abandons many illusions before she abandons instruments. The rungs ended at a ledge below the structure. I crawled onto it and lay there until the world stopped tilting. The knot lighthouse rose above me in pale spiraling walls. Close up, it had no door. Instead, an opening curved inward where a door might have been if a human imagination had been in charge. I entered on hands and knees. Inside was dry. That was the first miracle I did not question. The chamber was circular, narrow at the bottom and widening overhead. Its interior surface had the faint pearlescence of shell, layered in translucent bands, each band holding a different shade of white, bone, milk, moonlight, old paper, foam. The floor dipped toward a shallow basin full of black grit and fibrous material that might have been plant matter, animal matter, or something the structure produced for reasons unrelated to me. I made a fire. I should not have been able to. The flare had survived the crossing, the chase, the wave, and the climb still clipped to my suit. The fibrous material took the spark reluctantly, smoked blue, then caught with a small steady flame that smelled like salt and cedar and hot stone. I fed it broken fragments from the basin. The fire gave warmth. It gave light. It made shadows obey local rules for the first time in hours. I sat beside it and cried without sound. Not because I was safe, because for several minutes the chamber allowed me to perform a human ritual and receive a human result. Warmth, visibility, a circle of control small enough to believe in. I held my burned hand toward the flame. The blue-grey lines deepened in the firelight, then lightened as the flame moved. My fingers flexed more easily now. The skin did not look healed. It looked adapted. I thought of the eye. I thought of the number 1,000,000 miles and felt, not fear, but the opening of a door inside my mind that I could never close again. Pressure at that depth would not be pressure as I knew it. Water would not remain the substance I meant when I said water. It might be fluid only by courtesy, an exotic state of matter held in a geometry that did not require a planet, a mantle, a core. Did this world have a center? Did depth here curve into elsewhere? Was the black overhead empty space, unfinished sky, or the exposed interior of a universe still becoming capable of distance? The thoughts came faster once I stopped using them to survive. That frightened me less than it should have. The fire burned down slowly. When only a low red glow remained, unease returned. Not the predator's kind, not the sandbars. A quieter pressure from outside the chamber, as if the structure were waiting for me to notice something. I stood. My feet found the floor with too much confidence. The bare hand pressed once to the wall on my way out, and the wall seemed to press back with no motion at all. Outside, night had happened, or something had taken the role of night. The black overhead was no longer blank. I stepped onto the exterior platform and forgot the arch, the water, my body, the route behind me. There were no stars. That was the first and most devastating fact. No fixed points. No constellations, no moon, no planetary companion, no scattered lamps of distance. Above the water world, enormous luminous structures moved in slow formation, nebula-like veils, aurora-like bands, knots of colour that swelled and dimmed as if brightness were weather. Violet, green gold, bruised red, impossible white. They were impossibly far and impossibly close. Some seemed behind the black. Some seemed inside it. None held still long enough to orient by. The sky was not a sky. It was an event. I tried to find north. The thought was so useless I almost smiled. There is no back, I realized. Not as a direction. The lagoon was not west of here, not above, not behind the face. Home was not hidden by distance. It belonged to a structure of reality this place did not share. I could not walk back because back was a human agreement between spaces that remembered each other. This place did not remember mine that way. The platform under my feet trembled. At first I thought another wave had struck the arch. Then small points of light appeared along the structure's outer wall. One by one they opened. Not bulbs. Organs. Tiny rounded nodes embedded in the shell-like surface brightened from within, each giving off a pale blue-white glow. They formed lines up the tower, spirals around the exterior, clusters along ridges I had mistaken for decoration. The lights pulsed gently, irregularly, more like breath than circuitry. Then the top of the structure illuminated. A large bulbous chamber I had not seen clearly from below, filled with light from the inside. It glowed through layered shell, milky and bright, casting a slow beam across the water. Not a rotating lighthouse beam. Not a signal designed for ships. A biological radiance, swelling and narrowing as if the structure were opening and closing an enormous eye. The standing waves caught the light. The sandbars shone. Far below, dark channels revealed momentary depths and then concealed them again. The arch gleamed under me, not built, not grown in any ordinary sense, but present with the authority of both, architecture and shell, shelter and organism, false human logic completing itself as something that had never lied. I had simply insisted on translating it badly. I stood there while the structure lit itself around me. My feet had begun to grip the platform. Partly. The left slid when mist crossed the surface. The right held. My toes, bare now inside torn boots, pressed with a sensitivity I had not owned that morning. The grip was unreliable, uneven, and intimate. It felt less like a new ability than like my body negotiating without me. I should have hated it. I did hate it. But I also leaned into it because the platform was high, the waves were below, and survival does not wait for philosophical consent. Beyond the arch, the ocean lifted in slow, luminous bands under the shell light. Somewhere out there, an animal with an eye larger than my life moved through a depth I could not calculate. Somewhere behind me, in a lagoon that no longer had a direction, people might still be pulling on the severed line. I tried to imagine their reports. Equipment failure. Animal incident. Diver lost. No body recovered. I had become the kind of absence institutions write around. The thought should have broken me. Instead, under the unfinished universe and the breathing shell light, it became smaller than the fact of still being able to think. I was alive. I was changing. I was very far from home. And for the first time since the lagoon, I was no longer only trying to escape what I saw. I found the surface inside the structure after the light came on. It had been there before. I had crawled past it, leaned near it, mistaken it for another pale curve in the shell wall. Under firelight, it looked like texture. Under the structure's own bioluminescence, it became a panel. Not a sign. Not a plaque. Nothing so human. A flattened oval of softer material sat waist-high on the inner wall, bordered by ridges that curved around it like a growth scar. The surface was matte rather than pearled, faintly grey against the surrounding white. When I touched it, my bare fingers sank less than a millimeter and left pale marks that slowly faded. The structure could be marked. I stood in front of it for a long time. In one hand I held the dead utility sheath, the casing still intact, the knife long gone somewhere under black water, 2 sandbars behind me. In the other hand, the broken edge of the flare casing, its ignition end spent from the fire, its metal tip still hard enough to scratch. These were my instruments. That was when the final cruelty of being a scientist arrived. I wanted to write everything. I wanted to write the lagoon design, the hydrophone anomaly, the phrase in the water, the one-sided face, the yellow transition, the white resin access chamber, the vertical ocean, the natural sand maze, the false ridges, the digestive filaments, the frightened plesiosaur, the predator of the pupil, the depth calculations, the shell light, the sky that was not a sky. I wanted methods, measurements, diagrams, warnings, caveats. I wanted to state what I knew, what I inferred, what I suspected, and what I refused to conclude without additional data. I wanted to separate observation from interpretation because that is how you make terror useful. There was no paper, no archive, no stable instrument, no colleague to review my work, No language large enough to keep the facts from becoming lies by compression. The panel waited. I thought of didn't. No ways, playing the impossible voice and not wanting to call it a voice. I thought of the phrase that had pushed me here. Not where it is, where it faces. Matt Keir, whoever he had been to this story before I entered it, had left a direction disguised as a sentence, or a warning, or a misunderstanding useful enough to become both. His words had crossed through water, animal fear, pressure, and signal loss, and still they had moved me. Maybe that was all any message could do here. Not explain. Move someone correctly once. I pressed the broken flare casing to the panel and began to carve. The material resisted, then yielded in thin curls that smelled faintly of salt and hot shell. My hand cramped almost immediately. The burn lines across my palm tightened, then settled. The structure's light brightened by a degree as I cut the first word. I stopped. "Are you reading this?" I whispered. The chamber did not answer, but the top bulb outside pulsed once, and blue-white light moved through the wall in a slow wave. I decided that was not permission. I decided to continue anyway. The first version was too long. The water is not water. The way back is not behind you. The living things are larger than measurement. No. Too much. Too theatrical. Too certain. I scraped a line through it before the material hardened fully. The panel accepted the correction as if correction were part of the inscription. The second version was worse. "I am Helena Varga of R Epoch, and I have entered a saurian water world beyond ordinary dimensional return." A report title. A badge clinging to a woman who no longer had an organization in any useful direction. I crossed that out too. My hand shook. Not from fear now, though fear remained in me like a second skeleton. From grief. From exhaustion. From the ridiculous responsibility of leaving one sentence in a place where sentences did not belong. Who was it for? A future human dragged through some other face. Matt, if his signal still wandered the impossible systems. R Epic, if a salvage team ever became unlucky enough to succeed. The next animal that noticed small upright things. The structure itself. Myself, perhaps, before whatever I was becoming moved beyond the need to remember in words. The answer changed the line. I carved slowly, not back, through. Then I stopped. Too little. True, maybe. Useful, maybe. But incomplete. It warned without witnessing. It repeated the logic of the face without saying what I had learned after passing through it. Below it, I carved again. This place is alive with distance. That was closer. Not precise, not defensible, not a paper, but it held the ocean better than numbers did. It held the eye, the moving terrain, the depth that made depth into cosmology. It held the fact that distance here was not emptiness between things, but a living condition, a medium with appetite and memory and attention. I added my name because the human part of me demanded one ordinary fact. Helena Varga was here. The final inscription stood in 3 short lines. Not back. Through. This place is alive with distance. Helena Varga was here. I read it until the words stopped looking like language. Then I laughed, softly this time. "Peer review pending," I said. The joke broke something open. I sank to the floor beside the panel and let my head rest against the wall. The shell light moved through it in slow pulses. Warmth from the dead fire remained in the chamber's basin. Outside, the structure shone over the impossible water, and the water answered in glimmers from surfaces I could not categorize. I thought again about depth. 750,000 miles. 1 million. The numbers no longer arrived as horror. They came as doors my mind could open without needing to walk through immediately. Pressure at that scale would make every Earth equation a local dialect. Water might become a compressed intelligence of phase states, layered exotic fluids, mineral memory, biological circulation. A world that deep might not have a core, or might have something so unlike a core that the word became sentimental. Perhaps the black overhead was not sky because sky requires a surface beneath it and a universe outside it. Perhaps this place was not a planet, but an interval, a cosmological basin where old Earth life had continued along a direction evolution never took in my world. 66 million years was not enough. Or it was, if time here had depth too. I did not know. The not knowing no longer felt like failure. That frightened me a little. It comforted me more. My body was quieting into the place. I could feel it happening and could not stop it and was no longer entirely sure I wanted to. The suit bunched around my waist like shed skin. My bare shoulders no longer prickled in the air. My burned hand rested against the floor, and the ridges in my palm, blue-grey now, finely textured, not scales, but not quite not scales, touched the shell surface with a sensitivity that was becoming difficult to call pain. My feet had stopped slipping when I did not expect them to. Breath entered my lungs cleanly, too cleanly, as if the air had learned me or I had learned it. I might die here. That remained true. I might change until dying became the wrong verb. That seemed true as well. The old terror waited for me to return to it. I could feel it behind the thoughts, the lagoon gone, the line severed, the people who would write the incident report, the family who would receive carefully managed language, the fact that no one would know what I had seen unless the impossible became kind enough to carry 3 carved lines back through itself. I did not return to the terror, not fully. I had looked into an eye the size of a geography, and it had looked back without hunger. I had crossed a predator's path and a trap surface and a face that existed only when approached from the correct impossibility. I had stood under a sky still assembling the idea of stars. I had left a mark. No, I would not have chosen this. No, I would not call it mercy. But awe does not require consent. I was the first, perhaps. The first person to travel this far from the reality that made people, the first to stand in a saurian ocean where distance lived and water remembered other futures. The thought was vain and lonely and scientifically useless without a way to transmit it. It was also true enough to keep. Outside, the shell lighthouse brightened. I rose because the structure wanted me to, or because my body did, or because sitting still had become another way of pretending I could remain unchanged. At the opening, I looked once more at the carved panel. Not back. Through. This place is alive with distance. Helena Varga was here. The words were already darkening into the surface, not disappearing, not staying exactly as I had made them. The panel was taking them in. I stepped onto the exterior platform. The air moved against my face. The platform held under my feet. Far below, standing waves rose and lowered in the shell light. Farther still, something vast shifted under the water with a slowness that made the horizon breathe. I could not go back. I could go on. For the moment, that was not hope. It was enough. I began walking upward along the lit curve of the structure, thinking carefully while I still thought in words. Thank you for listening. This was an R Epoch SAURIAN story, a sealed prehistoric lagoon, an impossible signal, and an ocean where distance itself behaves like something alive. If you want more R Epoch files, subscribe and continue with the next case. Not back. Through.